All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on understanding your role in assessment with the Saskatchewan Assessment Management Agency. My name is Adam Brome, and I'm a Communications and Events Coordinator with SARM. We'll start off today's session with a few quick notes regarding the webinar platform and the session format. We'll then transition into the main presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be available on our website on the webinar's webpage following today's session. So please let us know if you have any technical difficulties during today's webinar through the chat. The chat box is located on either the top or bottom portion of your screen. Click on the comment bubble icon to view or participate in the chat at any time. This chat is visible by all participants and presenters. The chat is also where you will submit any questions that you may have for the Q&A session. All questions will be answered following the presentation, so please feel free to insert questions whenever throughout the presentation, and we will address it at that time. And if you do not, or if we don't answer your questions during that allotted time during the Q&A, we will follow up with you directly offline. So don't worry if we don't answer your question. And we will also be distributing today's presentation and the recording as usual through a webinar or through an email after today's webinar. And again, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to help you troubleshoot. And with saying that, I'll now hand it over to Jennifer Chamberlain, SARM's Manager of Community Planning, who will be moderating today's session.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us here. And the topic for today's webinar is to learn a little bit more about SAMA and the property assessment system. So we're quite pleased to provide this webinar. This is an area of importance and considerations to all RMs. So we're happy to have Shaun and Todd with us today to present on the topic. So Shaun Cooney is the Chief Assessment Governance Officer for the Saskatchewan Assessment Management Agency, SAMA. Shaun's position manages SAMA's Technical Standards and Policy Division, TS&P. This division is responsible for the research and development of provincial assessment policy and liaison with stakeholders. So Shaun started with SAMA in 1988 after graduating from the University of Saskatchewan. Shaun is a licensed member of the Saskatchewan Assessment Appraisers Association, SAAA, holds the CRA designation with the Appraisal Institute of Canada, AIC, and the CAE designation with the International Association of Assessing Officers, IAAO. So lots of acronyms there behind Shaun's name. Todd Treslan is also joining us as a presenter here today, and Todd Treslan is the Managing Director of the Assessment Services Division of SAMA. Todd's position is responsible for the effective delivery of assessment services to SAMA client municipalities. So born and raised in Beachy, Saskatchewan, Todd attended the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. He convocated in 1989 with a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture with a major in agronomy. Todd started with SAMA in 1989. Todd served on the SAMA Board of Directors as the representative for the Saskatchewan Assessors Association from 1994 to 1997. He started his current position in January of 2014. So with those introductions, I'll hand it over to Shaun and Todd to get going with the presentation. And as Adam mentioned, we'll have time for questions following that presentation.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that introduction. And it is wonderful to be with you all here today. Thank you for taking time out. It's a beautiful sunny day and you're devoting some time to assessment. So I think that's pretty marvelous. We do want to cover a fair bit here today, and we're going to keep it to a higher level. But both Todd and myself want to share the information that we have because we feel that the assessment function is so closely aligned to what the work that you're doing in municipalities. And we're going to kind of see how the two intersect. And I think the more that we can promote the assessment understanding, the better off we are in terms of the full package and having property owners understand assessments and their taxes. So with that, I'll just say that, thank you for the bio. Todd and I have been in assessment for 35 years, each of us. Someone said to me, it's really starting to show, and I don't disagree with that. but it's a wonderful field once you get into it, and there's a lot to it. And so we'll get going with that. We're going to do an introduction and overview of SAMA to let you know a bit about what the agency does. We'll talk about some assessment basics, some of the parameters of the system to help you understand in general how it works. Todd will speak about SAMA serving municipalities, so the work we do for client municipalities. And then the key of it is the understanding your role. And that's that little bit about how assessments relate to taxes and the interconnectivity on that. And as mentioned, we'll have time for questions and answers. So to begin with, the purpose of the assessment system, we develop and implement property assessments, which are the financial basis for the tax system. So the majority of money that municipalities get comes from the assessment, and that's why it's so important to have a stable assessment system. In SAMA, our governance function oversees $265 billion in assessment currently. And why that's important is that translates into tax revenues, 2.32 billion in tax revenues for the province. And that's split out 1.4 billion for municipalities for all the good work that you do. And that's up to 85% of the revenue that you receive. And then $735 million for the education system, which the province administers. So really important to, we always share this slide at the start just to remind folks of the system's importance in funding and also the need for stability. So our mission statement is to develop, regulate, and deliver a stable, cost-effective assessment system that is accurate, up-to-date, universal, equitable, and understandable. And that's a loaded mission statement, but really it's saying that we're seeking to do as stakeholders, doing the best that we can in terms of providing stable assessments over time and working with our client municipalities and other stakeholders to do that. So SAMA has our responsibilities set out in the Assessment Management Agency Act, and that includes governance. So that's the assessment rules, the publications, and overseeing that part of the system. We'll talk a bit about assessment services, and that's the area Todd is in, providing assessments to client municipalities. In legislation, we have a provision of information function, so providing assessment information to the province and to our stakeholders. A quality function, ensuring our assessments are kept to a certain standard and ensuring quality, both through a quality assurance division that Todd will speak to later on, and through internal quality measures that we administer. A big one now is communications, and that's what we're doing here today. And recently, we've just been reminded of the importance of sharing information on the assessment system so everyone can understand a little bit better the work that we're doing. And then innovation, which refers to things like technology, and the assessment system lends itself to new technology, and things like GIS and artificial intelligence in the future are going to be, the way that we do our assessment function. A little bit about SAMA in terms of statistics. We are established through the Assessment Management Agency Act and legislation. We have a 7-person board of directors, and they're made up of representatives from government, from SUMA, and from SARM. And so they represent the province in terms of assessment policy. And the area that Todd is in provides assessment services for the majority of municipalities in the province, 751 municipalities. And Todd will speak to the services that we're providing, including maintenance, annual maintenance, re-inspections, revaluation work, and supportive value. So currently our assessment system in our client municipalities, there's 875,000 properties that we're administering. We have 8 regional offices to do this, and that includes 163 permanent staff and 118 staff in assessment services. So that's our largest division. In terms of a breakdown of SAMA, if you're curious in terms of where your local office is, we're broken out, and you can see graphically, into the following regions: Melfort, Moose Jaw, North Battleford. Regina has a region and also an industrial unit. Saskatoon, Swift Current, Weyburn, and Yorkton. So we're spread out quite well across the province, and then we help administer and provide assessments for the Northern Administration District. The independent jurisdictions that we do not handle, SAMA doesn't because they're independent, would be Prince Albert, Regina, Saskatoon, and Swift Current. Those 4 cities have their own assessment departments and they provide their own assessment services. However, we do work closely with them. So that's a bit of background on SAMA. Now we'll turn to some assessment basics. And again, at a high level, for some of you, this will be a reminder because you'll know it, and others, it may be new. So we're kind of trying to hit the right level just to provide some information on how the system works. And we always like to start with an overview of the property tax system. And in this graphic, you can see the whole process starts with an assessed value. And that is on the far left side in that greenish house. And then it is multiplied by a tax rate to arrive at taxes payable. And so that in the simplest form is how the system works. We have a hand and it's exclusive to the assessed value, and many folks on this call will be involved in the tax side of things. Broken out in a bit more detail, the property assessment bubble on the left is administered by SAMA, and we have no authority beyond that. So when it gets to taxes, that belongs to other entities. The first in the next box, or circle rather, is tax classes and provincial percentages of value and exemptions. And that's administered by the province and overseen by the province, and GR stands for the Ministry of Government Relations. So they determine the provincial tax policy, and then it moves over to local municipalities. And there we've got the local mill rate and tax tools, which you would administer, or municipalities, and then you arrive at taxes payable. And a lot of the problems that we see in the system are folks will get their tax notice at the end, the result of the equation, and automatically turn back and blame maybe the assessment and find fault with the assessment. And quite often we can make corrections or the assessment will be correct. It's just the tax policy that they're not understanding, or the connectivity between the two. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more as well. In terms of mill rates and tax tools, again, this is not something SAMA has authority over. However, you would, of course, many of you, and have an understanding of this. So the education mill rate is set provincially by tax class each year by the province. And municipalities have local mill rates and tax tools, and it's your councils that are determining that. So you're applying a uniform mill rate. You may have mill rate factors for commercial, res, ag, and seasonal, depending on your municipality, a minimum tax or base tax option, local exemptions and abatements. So all of those locally can be administered. And in addition to that, the cities have some additional tools, including a phase-in of 2 to 4 years, so they can phase in the taxes, and the ability to establish subclasses for mill rate factors. So really fine-tuning the impact of the tax. And the main thing is Saskatchewan has a very robust bundle of tax tools for local municipalities. So you can really fine-tune how the tax consequences are laid out. And that's kind of unique to us and our province. In terms of the assessment side, so getting back to the very start of the equation and the area that Todd and I are working in, the system is based on a very simple principle called ad valorem, which means according or at the value. And so our goal, and we're always seeking to have a one-to-one relationship between what your property is worth, property values, and the property assessment. And it's unique in that in legislation, we're using mass appraisal and we're striving to achieve equity. So I'm going to explain mass appraisal in just a moment, but those are some requirements that we must use. We keep our values updated by doing annual maintenance for local municipalities, new construction and so forth. We do general re-inspections where we go to municipalities on a cycle and completely re-inspect the entire municipality. And then every 4 years, we have a revaluation, and we're updating values to a new economic point in time, which we call the base date, and keeping things as current as possible with the reval. In terms of assessment governance and the policy work we do, our goal is a stable, cost-effective system. So we really do have models that we've managed to keep as simple as possible for mass appraisal purposes. We're always seeking to ensure that the models are accurate as possible, up to date to the base date, universal in terms of they can value all similar property, equitable, so you're being treated fairly relative to a similar property in your municipality, and understandable. And that's where the simplifying the models has really helped. And an example is the residential model. We used to have 36 classes of property. We are now down to 7 classes, and it was far too complex to administer previously. It's much simpler now, and it aligns better with what others are doing. So that's an example of simplification. Important to note that the SAMA Board of Directors is overseeing assessment policy. So we go through a consultation process that I'll explain, but our board approves our publications and how we value property. And then the Minister of Government Relations approves our regulated manual, which is used to value all regulated property. And I'll explain that a bit more. Now, I talked about ad valorem and mass appraisal. In Saskatchewan, in legislation, there's 2 standards for valuing all property. So there's only one of 2 ways that you can value property in the province. One is the regulated property assessment valuation standard, and we achieve it when we apply the formulas, rules, and principles in our provincial manual uniformly and fairly. So this includes things like railway, pipeline, oil and gas, heavy industrial, ag. These are properties that are best valued by the cost approach because they don't typically sell, or we have the a unique system for our agricultural land based on productivity, which is it is tied to market through an overall adjustment. But these properties are unique. Their models are set out in a regulated manual, and to achieve equity, we must apply the manual. All the other property in the province of Saskatchewan falls under a market valuation standard, and we achieve it when we're using the market as the guide, if you will. So we're trying to value property uniformly as of the base date using all of the market data that is available to us. And that would be all of the sales information for properties that sell and all of the income information for properties that rent and can be valued on the income approach. So commercial, residential, multi-unit, seasonal, these are some properties that fall under the standard. So just those 2 means of valuing property. Probably the most important concept, I think, for anyone here today, if you're going to explain assessments to stakeholders or property owners, is that we're on a mass appraisal methodology. So that means we're using standard methods. We're using common data, so all of the sales that are available to us up to the base date. We use statistical testing, so we've got so many sales, we can use statistics to test the work that we do. And market value is the value that we're seeking, and it is the amount that a property would sell for with 4 conditions. One is that you're selling the full rights to the property, and that's the fee simple estate of the property in an open market. So we're assuming that you have a willing buyer and a willing seller, and so there's no undue influence on them, and they're acting, prudently and knowledgeably. So they have knowledge of the market. So really, we go through all of the sales that are available to us, and we're pulling out non-arm's length sales, bank foreclosures, related sales, and we're getting down to just, arm's length sales when we build our models. And I threw this slide in, and don't worry about reading it. It's very busy. This is more a reference for afterwards if you want to go back and explain to a property owner why their value may not match their single property appraisal that they may have had recently. Mass appraisal is different in several key ways, and I'll just explain it at a high level. Mass appraisal, as I mentioned, is the standard that we must use in the province of Saskatchewan to determine assessments. Single property appraisals are not allowed in the process of determining assessments or in supporting values on appeal. The mass appraisal is the purpose is property assessment, whereas a single property appraisal could be obtained for multiple reasons. And I listed a couple, such as buying and selling, estate planning, if you're going to get a mortgage. So it's a little different purpose. When we build our models for mass appraisal, we use all of the market data that's available to us, and then we test that model using statistics. A single property appraisal is done by an appraiser who goes and selects a few comparables to value a single property. And you can appreciate that that's a different process. It's more detailed and fine-tuned, and it's not practical for a mass appraiser. If we were to try to do a single property appraisal on every single property in the province of Saskatchewan, it just would not be feasible. We would never have enough money or time to be able to do it. And that's why we do use mass appraisal. So if you do have property owners coming in and they've got a bank appraisal, you might be able to explain it better by saying, well, when we do the assessments, we're not looking at those 3 unique comparables. We're looking at all similar property to determine a value for all property in the municipality as of the base date. So that is kind of a high-level review of the system. In terms of consultation, the area that I'm in is responsible for assessment policy and also for consultation. And again, in Saskatchewan, we have kind of a unique framework for that. When we update our policies every 4 years to go into our assessment publications and our board orders, we're meeting with as many stakeholders as possible. So we're meeting with individual organizations and stakeholder groups, industry groups, but we also have what are called SAMA's advisory committees, and they meet twice a year, and they're an urban, a rural, a city, and a commercial advisory group, and they're made up with a broad spectrum of stakeholders who will come to these meetings with feedback for the assessment system, and they'll review the work that we're doing on policy and ultimately comment on the manuals, the publications, and the orders that we're putting forward for each revaluation. So really have a lot of depth to the consultation that we do. And then just a couple slides to explain the framework and the documentation that sets the stage for a revaluation and for assessments. So we have 4 board orders, and I don't know if you're familiar with these, but very quickly, the first is a revaluation base date order, and it establishes the date to which all property is valued for every revaluation. So an example will be for the 2025 revaluation, which is the next reval, we're on a January 1, 2023 base date. All property is valued to that economic point in time. The market evidence order is establishing the market data that we can use to build our models. So that would be the sales and the rental income and expense information for property. And we're using information up to the base date. So Jan 1, 2023. We've got that information in now, and we can begin to analyze our models for the 2025 reval. And the reason we do that is we're building the models now, and we do a cutoff because market data that occurs after that base date will be used for a subsequent revaluation. And it's not available to us to build the models, hence it's not available to be used on supportive value. It's information we don't even have. So that gives us some framework for the reval. We have a quality assurance standard. So when we're done our valuations, we test them for every municipality. So for your RM, there would be quality assurance standards, and it's for the property that sells. And we have a standard assessment to sale ratio for all property, for residential and all other property of 9.5 to 1.05. We're striving for a 1-to-1 relationship between assessment and sale price, and that's what that ratio means. And we're striving for 1, and quite often it is at 1. But just to let you know, there is that quality check that we do on the market valuation standard. And lastly, we need an order to approve the regulated manual, and that is achieved through our board order and then also approval by the Minister of Government Relations. And then that publication has the force of law. And these are the publications. So the provincial manual I spoke of is the regulated manual. It's prescriptive. It has formulas, rules, and principles, and it tells us how to value properties that don't typically sell. So we would go in there to know how to value a mine, let's say, and have all of the information, and we have to follow the rules there. But for properties that sell, it's a little less regulated and it's more results focused. So SAMA has what's called a cost guide, which covers the market valuation standard for residential, commercial property, and that doesn't fall under the Marshall and Swift cost service. So it's a local type of cost that we use, and primarily the cost approach is within this document. For all other property, we're using what's called the Market Value Assessment in Saskatchewan Handbook. And again, this is under the market standard, and it primarily has information on the income approach to value for properties that rent. So those two market valuation standard based documents are used on the market standard. And there's more, like I mentioned, more flexibility because we're using the market to tell us what assessments should be. We're using the sales and the rental and income information. We can't create rules for everything out there. We're using standard methodologies and then building our models from that. 3 approaches to value, and you may or may not be familiar with this, but there's 3 ways that appraisers can value property. Mass appraisers are no different than single property appraisers. We have the cost approach, and that's for properties that don't typically sell and we don't have rental income information. So we can use the value of the land plus the replacement cost of the improvements with depreciation applied. And with that, we can also use a market adjustment factor, so sales, to take that cost approach and calibrate it to market value as of the base date. We have a sales comparison approach where we can actually, if we've got enough sales, we can build a multiple regression model. So a statistical model that will solve for the value of the property using all of the known variables on sold properties for the properties that didn't sell. So we will know the contributory value of the land and the improvement based on the square footage and other factors. The last approach is used for properties that rent, like I mentioned, so accommodation properties, hotels and motels, office buildings, retail, that type of thing. Where we have enough rental income information, we can actually use that as a predictor of the value of a property. And the approach is relatively involved, but essentially we're using the property that's sold and the income it generated to create a ratio called a capitalization rate. And those 3 approaches are likely a separate course on their own, but we are using all the approaches that a fee appraiser would use and mass appraisers are using across Canada. The important thing to know, and it really does dictate what we can do, is that we need sales, adequate sales, and we need our physical data to be up to date. And that's a continual process of keeping everything up to date. If we're going to use the rental income approach, we need property income and expense information. When we're all done our model building, we compare the model back to the population and we do checks. So I mentioned the quality assurance standard. We're also testing what a property is assessed at relative to what it's sold for as we build our models. And that tells us what level of value we are at. And then we have another statistic called the coefficient of dispersion, the COD. And all that checks for us statistically is how closely aligned values are for similar property. Are they tight, which is what we're seeking? Or are they spread out, which may indicate we need to do some more work? So those are 2 main statistics that assessment appraisers use. And we have to have a acceptable level of ASR to pass the quality assurance standard I mentioned, and also the primary confirmation audit that Todd is going to speak to. Just a final couple slides, looking ahead on the assessment policy front. It's really good to see assessment appeals are stabilizing. We went through a period with the 2021 revaluation where we had a real spike in appeals, and it was very litigious process. So we had to go through the board revision to the SMB to the Court of Appeal. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned on the market side of things, you can't write rules for everything, and we do need the courts to decide how things should be decided. And that's exactly what has happened. We've had a number of really, really good decisions, milestone type cases coming out of the courts. And one example is Affinity. I've got a slide on that. Court of Appeal decisions give us better guidance going forward. And the result is, and we expected this in Saskatchewan when we moved to market, we knew it would take time for the system to mature and decisions to move through the court. Now, when an assessment matter is taken to the court, we're seeing fewer leave applications granted. So the courts are saying, you know what, we've seen this issue before, we've decided on it, we've passed a decision, and there's no need for the court to become involved. So the decision of the Saskatchewan Municipal Board sets the value. And so that's a positive thing. Also looking ahead, SAMA is, commissioned a report. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this, but it was done by the International Property Tax Institute, an international consulting group, and they reviewed the assessment and tax system in Saskatchewan. And they came up with a number of recommendations for us to look at. And it's really a positive thing because they're looking at the system and with a view to what improvements can we make. And so at this stage in time, SAMA has a working group. It has representation from SARM on this working group, and they're looking at some of the main options for change. And those would be things such as, should we shorten the revaluation cycle from 4 years to something shorter? Should we change the base date lag period between the base date and the implementation of a reval, which is 24 months? Should we tighten that up a little bit to make values more current? And then should we continue to regulate properties? Should we allow single property appraisals? That type of thing. Any changes stemming from that would happen after the 2025 revaluation, but that's a major review looking at the system, and it's a positive. Last slide, I want to mention Court of Appeal decisions. The reason the system is stabilizing is we've got things like, this is called the affinity decision, we refer to it as, and you see a number of issues in yellow. These are all assessment and procedure matters that the Court of Appeal has decided on. And in this one landmark decision, they went back to all of the decisions that they've made to reaffirm how assessment appraisers should be applying legislation, the assessment rules in our province. And it covers a wide range of issues, including assessment practices, principles, the assessment cycle, and so on. And you can read this later, but it really does firm up a lot of understanding on the assessments, and it helps us going forward for a stable assessment system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and he's going to talk about serving municipalities.
Well, thank you, Shaun. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today, and going to change gears here a bit and talk about service provision and what SAMA does for our client municipalities. So we'll get started here. What we're here for, and we like to talk about it, is working together to meet your assessment needs. We have 751 client municipalities. Shaun mentioned we have two functions at SAMA. There's the property assessment governance and the provision of assessment services. And the provision of assessment services is the area that I'm the managing director of. So the focus today will be on the services that we do provide to our client municipalities, and I'll touch on our annual assessment maintenance, general re-inspections, provincial revaluations, assessment inquiries and appeals, and then communications and general assessment support. So that's something I'm going to touch on today. So let's start out first, the annual maintenance process. So our client municipalities can request what we call maintenance every year, and that's to prepare for the next assessment roll. So municipalities provide us with lists of properties that, and in the past, they would generally just fax us a list, and Todd's built a house, or Todd's remodeled a house, or Todd's removed a house, or there's been changes to our ag land, someone's broke some area and there's more cultivated acres, that type of thing. And we moved to an online function a few years ago called My SAMA, where municipalities subscribe to My SAMA, and you can start putting your maintenance requests in on an ongoing basis, and then submit them when you want to. And it made it a lot more efficient for us because we can pull the information right into our computer system, and then our appraisers can see what's there, and we can start working on it. So the first step, and it's important because maintenance occurs on a yearly basis, is to establish for a municipality, when do you want to have your maintenance? When do you want to get your numbers so that you can start working on your future assessment role? So we like to establish that up front. And we will negotiate dates. If we get a whole bunch of municipalities that say we want it on this date and we can't facilitate that, we'll talk to you in advance, and we'll try to negotiate a date that will work. We do say we have a 60-day turnaround time. And what often happens, if we're working on a maintenance list and then we're completed and we've we've delivered, and then we move on to another municipality, and the municipality may say, well, I have 10 more houses I would like you to look at. We can't just drop everything and go back to do those 10 houses. So typically it takes us about 60 days, because it's like going to the supermarket and you're first in line and there's someone three behind. The person that's 3 behind will have to wait till the next few people get to go through and buy their groceries. So anyway, it's just something we like to work with our clients and discuss that and what we can, our service obligations. So the maintenance changes that are entered into this SAMA app basically can be, you can use Munisoft and it ties into this, or we can use an Excel spreadsheet and import it. It just makes it a lot easier. So as a municipality, you can just kind of add things as you want. You can submit them when you want, or you can wait and submit them all at once. And what we suggest is that maintenance added for the future year by early October has the best chance of timely completion. And also we do a thing called callbacks. So if a property is started in 1 year, we'll flag it for a callback to go back the next year, if say it's partially complete. And we like the municipality to say, yeah, it looks like Todd probably did some work on that property, so we'll authorize you to go back out and check it. And we will check it and see if there's been more work done on it. So that's the maintenance list, and the callbacks are 2 parts to maintenance. And if you have any questions about the annual maintenance process, please contact any of our regions. And as Shaun mentioned, we have 8 regional offices across the province, and there's usually someone appointed to your municipality, and you can talk with them about the maintenance process. Maintenance delivery and on-time maintenance delivery is very important to us. And we had a few years where we slipped on our maintenance delivery, and that's when we said, when do you want your maintenance, and when we actually delivered it. And we've been tracking this for a number of years. And as you can see in this bar chart, and this is on time, it shows the numbers. And 2017 was a bad year for us. It was a reval year. We had a new computer system we were implementing. And if there's one thing we learned, don't implement a new computer system the year before a reval. And we only hit on-time maintenance delivery 18% of the time. And our clients told us that was unacceptable, and we need to improve going forward, because they need their numbers when they want them, and so they can start working on their role for the next year. And so we put a focus on maintenance delivery starting in 2018, and we set a goal of 85% on time and 95% within 3 weeks of the delivery date. And we increased our on-time maintenance delivery significantly in 2018, 19, 20. We slipped again a bit in the 2021 reval. So we fell back a bit, not as bad as in 2017. And then in 2022, we had another focus, and we were able to achieve close to 98% on-time delivery. And in 2023 now, we've delivered our maintenance, and we're at about 86.7%. We've slipped a bit, but we're over that 85% target. And this year, what we're working on is getting ready for the 2025 reval that Shaun mentioned. And we need to get working on the numbers, because the base date is January 1st, 2023, which was, 5-6 months ago, and we have a number of our staff working on those reval numbers. So that pulled some people off of maintenance. So that's why we dipped down a bit, but we're still we want to get your maintenance to you when you want it, and negotiate those dates. So we had a fairly successful year this year as well. General re-inspections, and this is the opportunity when we go into a municipality and we look at all the properties at the same time. And the primary objective is to improve the fairness and equity in the assessments of all properties in a municipality. And often we discover previously missed taxable assessments. And what we find is, not every municipality and not every individual takes out a building permit, or some municipalities don't even have a building permit process, that we do find things. Since the last general re-inspection, we may have been going to properties looking at them on maintenance, but that's the ones that we're asked to go look at. There are other properties that's maybe been a number of years since we've been to them. And so when we go in and we kind of look at all the properties at the same time, it's interesting what we do find. So re-inspections are important, and we've had a focused effort on re-inspections since 2018. And our goal is to inspect every property in the province at least once every 12 years. So if a property is not put on a maintenance list, our goal would be that it's looked at least once every 12 years. So we're currently 6 years into a 12-year cycle. We started the 12-year cycle in 2018, and we're on track. And things have been going fairly well, and we've put more of a focus on our re-inspections, which is good, because it just brings up everything more fair, more equitable. And the primary selection criteria is time since the last general re-inspection. So what we'll look at is, has it been 20 years since the last general reinspection. Those ones will get looked at first, and we'll move. So eventually we'll get to a point where we're on a 12-year inspection cycle, and in addition to the maintenance that we're doing as well. Our reinspection counts, and as you can see, I've just went back to 2017, and then for different types of property, commercial, residential, agricultural, and industrial, just to show that, starting in 2018, we put a renewed emphasis on reinspections, and we moved our component counts up significantly there, hit a high watermark in 2020. Even 2022, we had a really good year. So our goal is around 110,000 property reviews per year, and that would be re-inspections plus maintenance. So we typically see about 40,000 maintenance properties. So if you add that into our re-inspection counts, what we're showing here, that's coming out around that 110,000 property reviews per year. So we keep an eye on that, and that allows us to know that if we can do approximately 110,000 property reviews a year, we'll pretty much hit that 12-year re-inspection cycle. So that's how we've come up with the math on that. Revaluations. Shaun has touched a bit on this, and of course, all Canadian jurisdictions update assessments, and some do them every year, and other jurisdictions like SAMA and MPAC in Ontario do it every 4 years. And revals involve updating the values to be more current and understandable with improved fairness and equity. So we're valuing to all the properties in the province at a point in time as of a newer base date. And Shaun explained the difference between, we use mass appraisal, and they're as of the base date, and we use sales from the years leading up to the new base date. So we get those sales on a weekly basis from Information Services Corporation. We go through a process of verifying them and coming up when we do our analysis, estimating land values, building values, and put a value on the roll as of the base date. And if you have questions about specific reval, ask your SAMA representative to explain the new values sooner rather than later, and I'll touch on that in a few slides coming up. So the 2025 revaluation timeline, because that's when the next reval is, January 2023 is important because that's the base date, January 1st, 2023, and there's things that we had to update our computer system, and we started our market analysis because at that point, any of the sales leading up to January 1st, 2023 could be used for the 2025 revaluation. So we have a number of staff now working on analysis. In the March to April 2023 timeline, the manual is approved by the minister, so that's good. And then once that's locked in and we can continue to proceed, our next big date is April 1st of 2024. And that's when we need to deliver preliminary values to the ministry or the government relations so they can start their provincial tax policy. And that's a date that's set in legislation, and then they can take the next number of months to basically decide on the provincial percentages of value and get them to us at a later time. And at that time, we want to be in a position to start delivering preliminary values to you or to our clients so that we can start saying, hey, here's what we're seeing in your municipality from the last base date to the new base date. So from January 1st of 2019 to January 1st of 2023, here's the changes we've seen in the market, and here's some anticipated areas where you might want to focus on. And we start that dialogue early so that we can have those discussions in advance of 2025 when you advertise your roles. And then in the fall of 2024, after the provincial government has set its percentages of value, they provide that to us. We will recalculate our database, and then we provide final values or the initial values for 2025 in that January of 2025 timeframe. We'll also be doing some maintenance at that time. So you might get one package with everything, or you might get a reval package, and then we'll follow up with a maintenance package after that. And then that starts the process to get the roll going for 2025 with new values. So there's going to be a number of reports that we send out when we send out the preliminary values, and I think it's important that municipalities look at those numbers and ask questions about them. And we have three main reports. There's a municipal assessed value trend report, and I'll show these in more detail here in the next few slides. The municipal taxable value trend report, and then a preliminary value detail report. So these reports, and I've just taken what we used last reval, and what we'll be doing is similar ones to this. So on the value trend report, we break it down by the different tax classes within your jurisdiction. And we'll say, okay, here's what the last year's assessment was, and here's what the new assessment is based on the new base date. And you can see and it'll also compare to what the provincial averages is. But so you can see, okay, well, on average, did your residential go up 20%, and did the province go up 20%? That gives you an idea on from an education tax standpoint, potentially where there might not be many changes in your municipality on an education tax, but it also shows within your municipality, is there a shift to commercial or agricultural, and you can kind of start to see where there might be a change in values and which tax class might be affected more or less. So this is kind of an overall, here's what's happening. It gives you a kind of an idea on an overall basis. When we move into the taxable value trend report, what we're looking at there is, what are your taxable assessments? Because ultimately that's what your tax policy is going to be based on, is your taxable assessment. In rural municipalities, there's exemptions for farmhouse exemptions, that type of thing. So we estimate those as well. And what you're looking at in this report is, on a taxable basis, if you think of every tax class as having a piece of pie or a slice of pie, did that slice of the pie change? Did it get bigger or smaller when the reval numbers are going to be implemented? So what you can look at is, did commercial drop and did agricultural increase? And so it's a way within your municipality to sort of see where things are shifting with the revaluation. And each municipality will get reports like this when we send them out, and we're willing to talk to you about them as well. It's to assist you to see where there might be shifts within your municipality. Then we have a report that breaks down every individual property in your municipality. And it says, here's what the value was with the previous reval numbers, and here's what the new reval numbers are. And it's basically property by property. So it allows the administrator to look at, or the council to look at, what's happening with specific properties as a result of this revaluation. So there's a lot of information, but we suggest that you take the time to look at it and have us come out and talk it over with you. And one thing we're going to do is do an executive summary when we send these reports out, to say, here's what we're seeing in the data in your new numbers. There's residential's going up 40%, commercial's staying flat, that type of thing, just to kind of give you an idea where things are at. So that's something we'll be working on next year when we're sending this information out to you, our clients. And I guess one thing just to point out, assessment changes may not mean tax changes. And I guess when we talk about revenue neutrality, we can look at, say, before our revaluation, if a municipality needs $250,000 to operate and their taxable assessment's $25 million, well, then to generate that money, you need a mill rate of 10 mils. And that's the math that comes up with that. So after a reval, so say you still need $250,000, that hasn't changed to run the municipality, but your taxable assessment doubled. Well, then in order to get that $250,000, the mill rate can be backed off to 5 mils. So that just kind of, just because your assessment increases doesn't mean that the tax is going to change, but it all comes down to the tax policy that's applied to those assessment changes. So it's the relative assessment changes are more important than absolute value changes in a reval. And I just like to think about it, as I mentioned before, it's a piece of pie, and you can look at it by tax class within your municipality. Did the slice of pie increase or decrease? Or you can even look at it from the perspective of an individual property assessment. Did Todd Treslan's ag land parcel, did the piece of his pie get bigger or smaller? And then how does that compare to the rest of what happened in that municipality? So it's a good way to kind of think about it, and then that comes down to, did my share increase or get smaller? So a helpful hint when you're looking at reval changes is the average changes are not the issue. So if the average is 20% increase, the challenge comes from the outliers. So if most people go up 20%, but one property goes up 30 for some reason, and one only goes up 15, then that's where the deviations will be. So I've got some preliminary SAMA trends here that we're just displaying on this slide, and this is kind of initial analysis with the numbers. So residential, or 9%, seasonal up about 25%. So this is comparing January 1st of 2019 on a provincial basis to January 1st of 2023 in our initial review of things. Arable, ag land, and non-arable, meaning pasture land, we've done the analysis there, and we're seeing that over the 4-year period, from January 1st of 2019 to January 1st of 2023, we're seeing about a 40% increase in ag land values. So that we know that right now, that analysis is done, and that's locked in. And that compares to what FCC has reported over that 4-year period. So there's no real surprise there. And then we break it down by oil and gas, mines, just to kind of look on a provincial basis sort of what's happening. So it's good to see. And then as we do our more detailed analysis, and then we'll be coming out with your specifics next year. Also, we have the ability to do some GIS mapping where we can show shifts, and that's that slide on the graphic on the right there. We just pulled a municipality, and we have the ability to do this to show within a municipality where are the changes. Like is the red ones might be they're going up more than the ones that are blue, that type of thing. So those are some things we can do on a case-by-case basis for municipalities as well. So it's kind of graphically to look at rather than just looking at lines and lines of data. So that's something we can facilitate as well, and we can work with the municipality if they're interested in getting a map like that. There are opportunities to review and challenge assessments. And so I mentioned before the preliminary value submission, and that's where we send out those numbers next year in advance of the reval. And that could occur, between 3 to 9 months prior to the final value submission. And that's prior to reval years. So that's something to look at those numbers, see if they make sense, have us come out and do a presentation and kind of let us go over what we're finding in the market. And that's like in next year's time frame when we'd like to do that. Talk about it in advance so everyone has an understanding of what's going on with the new assessments. There's also a roll open period, obviously, when the roll gets opened, and then reval years at 60 days. So from the time the roll opens, there's 60 days that an individual can launch an appeal on their property. And in non-reval years, years 2, 3, and 4 of the cycle, you have 30 days from the time the roll opens to go over, talk to your appraiser, see if you need to launch an appeal. So there's that type of thing. There's also the agreement to adjust process, which if an appeal is launched and there's an error noted, and the property owner, SAMA, and the municipality agree, we can do what's called an agreement to adjust. The value gets changed, and then the appeal is withdrawn. So that is a definite process, and it works well for fixing things that are obvious errors within the data. There's also the local board of revision, which if an appeal proceeds and it's going to actually be heard by a board of revision, and SAMA is there to talk about if there's any assessment issues. If there's tax class or exemption issues, usually the municipality handles those types of appeals. And there's also a new provincial board of revision training program currently underway that's certifying board of revisions. And then municipalities need to appoint a board of revision on a yearly basis, and then that board of revision will hear any appeals that need to be heard by it. There's also a second level of appeal after a board of revision makes a decision. Each party has 30 days to decide if they want to appeal that decision to the Saskatchewan Municipal Board. So that's a level of appeal administered by the provincial government, and it's looking at it looks at what was on the record at the board of revision and just reviewing the decision of the board of revision, and then usually their decisions are final. Unless there's a point of law, which then can be taken to the Court of Appeal. So that's kind of the avenues for appeals throughout for assessment appeals in the province of Saskatchewan. Just thought I'd look at some appeal trends, and I go back a long way on this slide, and I know it says 2014 over on the far right. So if the years are represented by the red bars, and the blue bars beside them are 4 years prior. So it's actually, the slide goes back to about 2010. And these are appeals in our SAMA jurisdictions. And it's just interesting to look at from a trend perspective, and it helps us in planning because appeals happen yearly. And it helps us to identify in the year of the cycle, how many appeals might we have? And because we have to work on the appeals when they happen. We can't just say, oh, we'll do them later. So it helps us with our planning. So if you look back to the far right blue bars, which would be 2010, 2011, 2012, we had less than 1,000 appeals in our jurisdictions. And then what we started to see happening, there's a reval year, the blue bar that's above the 2017 in 2013. We saw appeals go up in that year to about 4,300 appeals. And then things start tapering off in years 2, 3, and 4. And then in 2017, we hit a high watermark for appeals of about 7,200. And then as you can see in 2018, 19, 20, they tapered off in years 2, 3, and 4 of the cycle. And then in 2021, it was a reval year, and as you can see, compared to the 2017 reval, we actually had about half the number of appeals, which is good. And then in 2022, our appeal levels were under 1,000 again. So it's been a number of years since we've been under 1,000 appeals in our jurisdiction, but it's nice to see, because if the less time we have to spend on appeals, and they do take a lot of time, we find that it takes about a day to deal with an appeal. Some take longer, some less. Even when you look at those agreements to adjust, which you think could be quite simple, they do take time to work through, because it might involve an inspection and a change to the property and getting the signatures and that. But it does take time. So the less time we need to spend on appeals, the more time we can spend on maintenance and re-inspections during the year. And as you can see with the cycle we have, there's usually more appeals in year 1, which is the reval year, and then it tapers off in years 2, 3, and 4. So it helps us with our planning. But it's interesting to look at the graphics, and I'm a numbers guy, so I like to kind of display that. But as you can see, reval years have about double the appeals that a non-reval year does. I'll touch base here on our assessment confirmation process that's managed by our quality assurance division, and they're a separate division at SAMA, and they monitor an annual process intended to ensure that assessments placed on the assessment roll is done in compliance with the legislation. So it's a check. It includes a roll balancing process and a number of quality assurance and confirmation process audits. So it's good because it allows for the municipality has their role. Quality Assurance Division monitors that, and we check to make sure that our computer system matches. So it's a good check and balance as well in our jurisdictions to make sure that we're on the same page with our numbers. And so basically the municipality completes and submits an assessment return after the border revisions are rendered in each year. So that's kind of, once your border revision is dealt with, you get those decisions in there, any agreements to adjust, you submit your annual return, and then our Quality Assurance Division works on their processes. And confirmation is important because it's required to enforce the collection of taxes. So if you aren't confirmed, technically you can't enforce the collection of taxes in your jurisdiction. And you can always contact Quality Assurance Division if assistance is required. And these are just some examples. They have, here's an assessment return that would come out on a yearly basis, and it explains how you need to fill it out, and some steps. And here's the things you need to fill out. And have you thought of these things? Did you complete this? And then you send it in after your border revision, and they're more than willing to help with the filling out of the documents and going through that process. And then you can get your confirmation certificate once you've passed. We have a number of information sources at SAMA. We have our website, www.sama.sk.ca. There are online manuals on there, handbooks, frequently asked questions. There's pamphlets and fact sheets, so there's a wealth of information there. There's a video on property assessment that's fairly simple, but it's good. It kind of gives people I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that. SAMA View is an important thing. It's like our portal for our jurisdictions for property owners to look at their assessments or their neighbors' assessments, and it's GIS based. And it's a subscription, but it's a free subscription. You sign up, you create an account if you're just a regular user and you just want to look at some properties, and you get like 25 credits after you've set up your account. And you can go in any of our jurisdictions and look at properties and look at the characteristics on a property. You can look at your property, you can look at your neighbor's property. And it's really interactive. And there's also a nice function there. You can up in the top right corner on the left graphic, you can click on, there's an aerial image button so that you can look at things on a lot block format or turn the aerial imagery on. And you can actually drill down and find properties and click on them and look at what their assessments are. So it's a really interactive tool, and we encourage property owners and municipalities to get familiar with it. And there's a lot of information on there. And if you're a commercial user, like a realtor or an appraiser, that we have a subscription service, and then you can pay an amount and get your credits, more credits than if you need more than 25, obviously. And you can subscribe on a yearly basis and then have access to SAMA's the data that we have on properties in our jurisdiction. So I would encourage people to go on, check out SAMA View and play with it. And if you have questions, you can always call in, but it's fairly intuitive, and it's a great tool to see how properties are assessed in our jurisdictions. And with that, that's kind of an overview of assessment services. And are there any questions?
Thanks, Shaun and Todd. A great presentation and lots of information there. So we are running a bit short on time. If you do need to take off, feel free to. We will keep the recording going for any of the questions, and a link will be sent out to you afterwards, so you can always follow up if you do need to take off. But for those of you who are hopefully willing to stick around a little bit past, we can maybe get going on any questions that you do have. So as Adam mentioned earlier, just enter any question into the chat box, and we can read them off here, and I'll let Shaun and Todd decide who wants to jump in with a response for them. Okay, so our first one here is, I'm curious about irrigation. Will there be a new standard coming for the uniform property values for these properties?
Well, maybe I could start with that one, Todd. I know in the past we've looked at irrigation, and we have not seen a difference in selling price in terms of whether it's irrigated or not. One of the problems is it can be viewed as a chattel, not something that's permanent or fixed permanently. So right now, as it stands, irrigation equipment is not accessible, nor is there a difference in the value of those lands. That's not to say that we couldn't look at it in the future once again, but that has been looked at in the past and is not something that we've added value for.
I think just to follow on that, Shaun, and I know in the past there was a proposal, this is years ago, to, because we have a productivity-based ag land assessment system. So the thought was, well, if you're irrigating, you're obviously getting higher yields, so there should be more productivity. And I know it was brought in to increase the productivity on irrigated quarters, and that didn't go over well with property owners. And also, there's an additional cost on a property that has irrigation. There's higher power, water rates, that type of thing. So from a perspective of a net income, it was kind of backed off, and basically it was the base productivity of the soil without the irrigation is how all lands in the province are assessed at this time. It could be looked at in the future, I know, as Shaun mentioned, but that's sort of what happened from a historical perspective.
I think, yeah, under legislation, things like the pivots currently aren't considered equipment that we can even assess. So to contemplate doing that, we'd need to have a complete review and look at the accessibility and maybe even the legislation to allow us to assess it. But like Todd said, for now, that's not being looked at.
Great, thanks. I don't see any other questions actually coming through here. You guys were just too good with your presentations. Lots of information covered there, so might have answered them through it. Maybe give it another minute, see if any others trickle through here. Again, anyone, if you do have questions, just enter them right into the chat box for us.
I guess one thing to just comment on, if you have a question or you think about something later this afternoon, you can contact the regional office that your municipality is located in, or Shaun and I are available to answer questions as well. So yeah, there's lots of options.
For sure.
Okay, I think that might actually be it for questions at the moment. So we'll leave the presentation there. Thanks again, Adam, for organizing the webinar, as well for Shaun and Todd for presenting and providing a great overview, as I said, and for all of you for coming out and joining us today. We'll let you get out and into some of this nice sunlight. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks,
Have a good day.
everyone.
Thank you.